Christian is going to start by just kind of prefacing a little bit about the class. We're going to talk about the description, the goals, talk a little bit about some of the pedagogical background, some informal assessment, what worked for us, what didn't work for us, and then end with a little bit on contemplative pedagogies and how we see that playing into our project.
Yeah, so given the 102 focuses on critical reading, 101 focuses on composition more broadly. Mm-hmm. And so we were, over the summer, thinking about what we should do. And it was also the summer of the Charleston tragedy. The Confederate flag was still on the lawn at the State House. Bree Newsom had taken it down. And we both felt, compelled that this is the place that we need to talk about these issues.
One of the other reasons that I think we were really interested in approaching race and approaching identity within the classroom, for me, came down to a change in population that I experienced in student body from being at UMass for graduate school to coming to Coastal. And part of that was an increase in racial diversity that UMass certainly has a lot of diversity in a lot of different ways as well. But the classrooms that I was working in tended to be more white faces, and the diversity happened more in terms of class, as well in terms of international populations. It was much higher at UMass. Here I was experiencing, as Christian mentioned, a classroom that had this really unique mixture of people from different regions, from different parts of the U.S., and I was experiencing racial diversity in the classroom in these really exciting ways that I wanted to try to think about how we could access to really help students get the chance to get to know each other and get to know people from areas beyond their immediate realms. So we decided to try to approach difficult topics within the class using what we hoped would be challenging readings, and to think about ways that text could be an entry point for difficult social conversation. And we also reviewed some materials from Tasha Souza to consider ways that we could construct and navigate classroom space that was intentionally designed for dialogues that might be uncomfortable. And one of the most practical suggestions that she had for us was to create a list of classroom guidelines. So the guidelines, again, in the handout, we used in my class as really touchstones every once in a while. 3 times throughout the semester, we came back to the guidelines. We did little mini assessments where I asked students to identify which guideline they thought was most significant and why. We did go around the room and each student would share their reflection. We took tallies and did little sort of informal votes to think about which guideline won. And I think this could certainly be an interesting part of an additional classroom study assessment. There was a little bit of change throughout the semester in terms of which guideline the students thought was most significant. In particular, in one class, at the beginning of the semester, we were very much a fan of guideline number 1, be an active listener. There's a slight possibility that that is because that was in fact guideline number 1 and perhaps the main guideline that was most visible to the students. There's a little bit of fuzziness there. But throughout the semester around midterm, the students were very interested in the fact, in number 4, to grow our classroom, we need to hear everyone's voices. We need to try to participate as much as you can. Remember that participation can take many forms. And at this point in the semester, we had done quite a lot of readings, and I was starting to notice, and Samantha Riley, who is my graduate teaching assistant who worked with me throughout this semester, was starting to notice that we were really struggling to talk about a lot of the readings in class. I think the white students felt silenced because we tended to use a lens of privilege and oppression. So I think that they felt uncomfortable making statements about the readings. I think the students of color in the class struggled to find voice as well and perhaps felt implicated. So I think there were ways in which our class was struggling to be open with one another and to feel comfortable with one another, which completely makes sense in that kind of context when you're talking about these kinds of ideas.
So the three primary approaches to the course, are the 3 sort of bedrock things that we relied on for our approach, is that composition is always embodied. And this largely comes from Kristen Fleckenstein's work on embodiment and embodied literacies. Sort of a quote that embodies that is, a corporeal literacy points us to the material dimension of reading, writing, to meaning's reliance on our physical participation in the world. So to get students to sort of realize that their bodies matter, that their bodies signify, that their approaches to literacy is always in relationship to that body, and those sort of material concerns. Second one, critical reading, which I talked about a little bit already, is just the sense that in the Bartholomew's notion of critical reading, the problem for me, at least in the moment, is not whether or what students should read, but how. And so this attention to reading differently that 102 really focuses on, but we wanted to touch that in 101 as well. And then finally, and perhaps most, the one that's most difficult to do in class is race as a question. Rachel Dolezal was still an issue when we were talking about this. Not that she's not an issue anymore, but the questions of transraciality and what does it mean to be transracial were taken seriously in the class. And just the idea that race is a social construct. So we read the first 21 pages of Coates's Between the World and Me, and on page 7 he makes this really great claim that race is the child of racism, not the father. In 2014, Harvard University and MTV and the David Binder Research Group teamed up to do these implicit bias tests.
We asked students to take 2 or 3 tests the first night of homework and write a short reflection on the tests. They also read the results of the MTV Bias Survey, which was a large-scale survey of millennials, asking them about racial bias, asking them about their sort of interests in talking about race, if they thought racism still existed, what they thought people's experiences were based on race. And so we were trying to encourage them to kind of put together this abstract survey data of their age group, asking about or that identified the presence or the acknowledgement of racial bias and a willingness and a desire to talk about racism.
Overwhelmingly, millennials, according to the survey data, want to talk about race but lack venues in which to openly discuss these things, which they all said at the beginning of the course was absolutely true.
We each had a different sequence of assignments to continue to move students through the semester, so we used readings in the book. We both began with a narrative assignment for our Unit 1 assignment, asking students to use descriptive writing and to, play the sort of show versus tell game, or kind of the writing skills that we worked with, and write a narrative about themselves, write about an object that they felt represented them, and think a little bit about the communities that object connected them with. And we have sample assignment sheets for Unit 1 and Unit 2 if anyone's interested. For the second unit, our classes slowly began to kind of turn a little bit.
Probably inevitable.
Absolutely.
As we teach to our strengths.
But the main idea of Unit 2 was to help students then begin to build a vocabulary for talking about race and racism, and talk about sort of socially ascribed identities. I mean, we did take an intersectional approach to identity. I feel like that's important to kind of. We should have maybe started with that early on. We tried to focus on the ways that identities come together in the readings, but with a particular emphasis on race and racism. And at this point, the key words that we used to sort of structure the class through the readings that we chose started to differ a little bit. Unit 3 was a research project. I, at this point, tried to turn students back to their Unit 1 with some occasional successes and encourage them to research the object or the community that they had begun with. So we started with the self. We started to build vocabulary. We thought about active versus passive versus actively anti-racism. We talked a little bit about, I'm trying to think about some of our keywords here. Double consciousness. We talked a little bit about the mestizo construction of identity, which is kind of in contrast to Canadian multiculturalism. So thinking about identity as, or thinking about culture as sort of more mixed than sort of distinct types of people coming together versus that sort of mixing pot. And Unit 4, we attempted in my class to actually rewrite our narratives from Unit 1, using the research from Unit 3, to create a more critical or perhaps a more savvy portrait of self than where we had started at the beginning.
Yeah, so I basically did the same thing for Unit 1. Unit 2 took a more concept-based approach, and then we just sort of further built that idiom. And for the last essay, I didn't return to their first personal narrative. I actually had them formulate an argument about, we read the James Baldwin piece that's on here, A Stranger in the Village, and the Coates piece, and they had to argue whether or not Coates could be considered the sort of contemporary iteration of James Baldwin, and if so, how and why. But it turns out talking about race in the classroom is a really difficult thing to do well and to do ethically and responsibly. One of the things that we noticed is that there is, in fact, a big distinction between multiculturalism and anti-racist pedagogies. New to us.
I think it was just something that we hadn't studied much on.
Yeah.
And so I think that the ways in which we were making sense of what we were doing didn't necessarily have the backing in practice that we needed.
And students' reluctance or inability to discuss race, and I want to say that I don't want to pin that on the students' responsibility. I mean, this is also because of the way that we design the course and how we approach that first week with the teaming of the bias survey and the white privilege essay. We discovered I knew of Keith Gilliard's work, but it never sort of hit me in the way that it did after teaching this class. So particularly this quote, although challenges to racism and exclusion launched the multicultural movement, the rhetoric and aims of that movement are not necessarily coterminous with the rhetoric and aims of, say, anti-racism, which he describes as unflinching criticism of racist domination and its impact on education, including composition curriculum. And another sort of pivotal piece for us was Barbara Schneider's Uncommon Ground, Narcissistic Reading and Material Racism, which she basically makes this claim that students will largely... She uses the bell hooks piece that we assigned as well. She assigned the bell hooks piece, and she gets students writing about, say, how they're oppressed, being cheerleaders, or being, that they can relate to bell hooks in a way because of their own experiences that elides difference. She says it way better than I can. The commodified definition of multiculturalism as a grand narrative that celebrates our national unity across difference, a tale in which difference is rendered superficial and similarity substantial. And so that was sort of like an aha moment for us when we were thinking about sort of reflecting on the end of the semester.
And it gives us language to think as well about, teaching pieces like Du Bois's Double Consciousness, which students grasp onto in some really interesting ways. But many of those ways do, in fact, elide difference and focus on the sort of relation that students can feel with this idea of double consciousness. And one of the lessons I think that we are considering as we go into this again is slowing down with the readings that we do choose and spending more time with them so that we can actually get past that kind of superficial relationship that students create, and try to move past the papers about double consciousness that say things like, oh, well, I have this privileged experience and I therefore can relate to double consciousness because I am read in a certain way.
Going into anti-racist pedagogy, when a lot of work has been done in largely white contexts. So there's a book, Jennifer Trainer's book, Rethinking Racism, Emotion, Persuasion, and Literacy Education in an All-White High School. And she promotes this sort of allies approach, which doesn't immediately make the student, a white student, feel that they're being implicated in a combative sort of way. In Beverly Tatum's later work, she sort of gets to this when she says, for whites, the process involves becoming aware of one's whiteness, accepting this aspect of one's identity as socially meaningful and personally salient, and ultimately internalizing a realistically positive view of whiteness, which is not based on assumed superiority. The other thing, besides the multiculturalist versus anti-racist pedagogies, is getting over the reluctance to listen and the reluctance to discuss.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I plan to do next semester, which I've never done before, even though I've heard the term quite a bit, is this notion of fishbowl conversations. And there's open fishbowls and closed fishbowls. Right. Open fishbowls leave a seat open, so if a student that's outside that's listening but isn't sort of allowed to be in the discussion can sit in the chair. Another student that feels like the conversation's not so productive for them at that moment can leave. Mm-hmm. It's just sort of a way to remove myself as the discussion leader, as sort of the go-to person that they're all talking to, so that they're talking to one another rather than me. And I think that will be productive. Emma's done work on rhetorical listening in her previous research, but this idea of rhetorical listening has become huge for us.
The idea of rhetorical listening is that listening can be revived or should be revived as a trope for making meaning, and can be incredibly useful for communication across cultures, to try to encourage the role of the speaker, the act of the listener, to be aware of the ideologies and of the lenses that we bring to a conversation, and think about the ways that those lenses, that those ideologies impact what we hear and how we make meaning from what we hear. So the idea is to push for a sort of deeper type of listening, a deeper way of understanding, and actually the way that Ratcliffe frames it, I don't think it's in this quote per se, but one of the most quoted moments from her ideas are that we should invert the term understanding to stand under the discourses that we encounter as researchers, that we encounter as teachers, that we encounter as students, and allow them to wash over us, and that we linger. The idea here is really to encourage the co-creation of knowledge. It is to deconstruct the hierarchies in either research or in the classroom, and to think a little bit about ways that we bring particular expectations to conversations, regardless of the context that those conversations are happening in, and that when we strive to make those expectations transparent, we can perhaps circumvent them somehow, or at least try to see through other lenses beyond sort of our own. Some of the questions that we've been coming up with based on our classroom experience: how can we more efficiently navigate these conversations in the classroom and work past the often emotional walls that students and ourselves encounter in the classroom space? How can we better support our students, all of them, as they encounter these difficult ideas? And how can we also support ourselves, I think, is part of this as well. And we happened to come across the tree of contemplative practices. I don't know
exactly what the exact moment was that we came across.
That lives somewhere on the internet that includes the cultivation of things like deep listening, storytelling, dialogue, bearing witness, meditation, silence.
If you're getting squeamish at this kind of rhetoric, you're not alone. Both Emma and I come out of a post-elbow anti-expressivist moment. So we're as trepidatious as you are.
One of the things for me that has been really exciting, starting and continuing to do research on the ways that contemplative pedagogy has been taken up in writing classrooms, really is this emphasis on the embodied nature of the classroom, the embodied nature of writing, the ways in which feminist pedagogies and feminist methodological practices and perspectives can come into these conversations about mindfulness, can come into these conversations about trying to encourage and help students to engage in acts like bearing witness, not whiteness, with one another, thinking about each other's stories and each other's narratives in ways that show compassion and empathy, as opposed to and acknowledge difference in ways that are productive, as opposed to immediately trying to kind of bridge over those differences to relate to one another.
Arthur Zajonc, he's a physicist at Amherst College. His book is sort of pivotal in this whole contemplative pedagogy movement, meditation as contemplative inquiry. And he's got a notion of the way he incorporates contemplative practice in the classrooms to have students for the first 5 minutes to focus on an object, and it's really about, and he places all of this in brain biology, basically, in like the neurodynamics of the mind and how attention works. And he has students focus on a singular object. He uses the example of a paperclip. It can be anything, really, for about 5 minutes. And then he introduces the focused attention, which is the text, a line from the text, or maybe a concept that's being discussed that day. He does this in the context of physics, but it could be anything. And then he has students oscillate attention between that singular focus and a more open presence, not thinking about anything necessarily. And he says in those moments is where ideas emerge and where real sort of reflective, engaged discussion can happen.
The difficulties that we faced in terms of encouraging conversation amongst the students. It makes a lot of sense to consider a way to approach this idea of slowing down, the honoring
Opening
of
up this kind
silence.
of entrenchment that they have.
Yeah, and the exploration of silence and of listening, and listening in a way that is more than just
All of
sort
which
of nominal.